2, mayday, mayday, we have an emergency. Roger, we have fire on engine number 3, we have fire on engine number 3. Hello, 1862, we lost number 3 and number 4 engine, number 3 and number 4 engine.
Going down, 1862, going down, going down.
Is gebeurd. Heeft geen zin, hij is geknapt.
4th of October 1992. An El Al Boeing 747-200 freighter departs from Schiphol Airport with 3 crew members and an employee traveling to Tel Aviv on a calm Sunday morning. The experienced crew was doing their usual checks, not knowing that a nightmare was about to begin. Shortly after takeoff, the plane experiences difficulties, and just 5 minutes later, the crew announces they're returning to Schiphol. But by then, it is already too late. Neither the pilots nor the crew members were aware that they were about to be part of the largest aviation disaster on Dutch soil ever recorded. This is the tragic story of El Al Flight 1862. On the afternoon of October 4th, 1992, a Boeing 747 cargo aircraft is preparing for El Al Flight 1862. The cargo includes approximately 115 tons of goods, such as fruits, computer components, and perfumes. On board are 3 crew members and 1 passenger. The El Al Flight 1862 will leave the Kennedy International Airport in New York to Ben Gurion International Airport in Tel Aviv, Israel. But along the way, they will make a stopover at the Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, where it will refuel and carry additional cargo before heading to its destination. The crew members have incredible experience flying aircraft over the years. The crew consists of 59-year-old Captain Yitzhak Fuchs. Captain Fuchs is a highly experienced pilot, boasting over 25,000 flight hours. Before joining El Al, he served as a fighter bomber pilot in the Israeli Air Force for 10 years. Another crew member aboard the aircraft is flight engineer Gedalia Sofer. He is 61 years old with a remarkable 26,000 flight hours. He also shows great familiarity with the Boeing 747 cargo aircraft, since an incredible 15,000 of his flight hours have been spent flying Boeing 747s. His career with El Al spans 37 years. The third crew member is First Officer Arnon Ohad, who is 32 years old. Although First Officer Ohad isn't as highly ranked as Captain Fuchs and Flight Engineer Sofer, he is still a competent pilot with 4,288 flight hours to his belt. And like Flight Engineer Sofer, First Officer Ohad has some level of experience flying Boeing 747s with 612 hours logged. He has also been with El Al for 10 years. The only passenger on the El Al Flight 1862 is Anat Solomon, a 23-year-old. Anat Solomon is a non-revenue passenger and also an El Al employee stationed in Amsterdam. Her fiancé, who is also an El Al employee, used his connections to help her secure a free flight from Israel aboard the cargo plane. Anat is traveling to her home country to prepare for their wedding. During the flight from New York to Amsterdam, the crew notices 3 problems. The autopilot speed regulator is fluctuating, the voltage of the electrical generator on the third engine is unstable, and there are issues with the radio. However, they successfully land the aircraft in Amsterdam for the planned stopover. When they arrived at their first stop, they relayed the issues they experienced to the team at the Schiphol Airport, who ran multiple checks. At around 6:20 that evening, the aircraft is ready to continue its journey, even though it's slightly behind schedule due to a slot restriction. Now, the LAI 1862 flight is ready to fly. The plane has been filled with more than 74,000 liters of fuel and more loads, and it now weighs 114 tons of cargo. The pilot starts the engines. Once the 4 engines are up, the captain taxis the aircraft to the runway. A few minutes later, Captain Fuchs positions the plane on the runway of the Schiphol Airport. He hands control to First Officer Ohad, who will fly the plane for the rest of the journey. On the other hand, the captain will handle radio calls and paperwork. At 7:21 p.m., the first officer pushes the engines to take off thrust, and the 747 accelerates down the runway. Ohad pulls back on the control column and lifts the plane into the evening sky. For the first few minutes, everything goes as planned. The cargo plane climbs rapidly, heading north, passing through 6,000 feet over the harbor, and the pilots retract the landing gear and then the flaps. But just a few minutes after takeoff, the flight that was going as planned soon became a horror. As the EIAI Flight 1862 turns above the Geumir Lake, it experiences a critical failure with the engine pylon, which causes 2 engines to detach from the aircraft. Engine number 3, on the right wing near the fuselage, pulls off from the wing. Before falling, it moves forward and damages the wing slats. Then it falls back and hits engine number 4, which is farther out on the right wing. The impact tears engine number 4 off the wing. As the two engines fall off, they rip out a 33-foot section of the wing's leading edge. As the two engines fell off the aircraft, they also tore out a 33-foot stretch part of the aircraft's wing's leading edge. The pilots tried to understand what was happening. They had received several trainings on how to handle cases of engine failure and even double engine failure, but this was not a scenario they had ever trained for. The sharp noise coming from the Boeing 747 cargo aircraft in the air caught the attention of ground witnesses. Some boaters on the Bijlmer Lake notified the Netherlands Coast Guard of objects falling off an aircraft. We could never know exactly how the crew reacted, but evidence indicates that Captain Fuchs takes control from First Officer Ohad and levels the plane, overcoming the massive yaw to the right, induced by the failed engines and damaged wing. In the cockpit, Captain Fuchs is struggling to regain control of the plane. With all the thrust now coming from the left side, the plane is starting to turn right. To prevent this and keep the plane leveled, the captain has to practically stand on the left rotor as he wrestles with the plane. Meanwhile, the other crew members are trying to assess the damage. This is made harder because when the two engines left the wing, they also tore through lots of wiring, including the wires for the fire warning system. If both wires were damaged, it would set off a fire warning in the cockpit and onboard Flight 1862. But that's not happening. There's no fire on engine number 3. Actually, they don't even have engine number 3 or 4 anymore. As they head downwind, the pilots still don't realize how serious their situation is. At this point, the crew knows they are not in great shape to continue the flight to Tel Aviv, but they don't know how severe the situation is. They did not know that the engines were not just faulty, but had fallen off the aircraft. And due to the Boeing 747 cargo aircraft wings and cockpit placement, the engines of the 747 are not visible from the cockpit, so they have no way of knowing that engines 3 and 4 have physically left the plane. When the crew sees they have lost power from engines number 3 and 4, they quickly make a mayday call to Schiphol Airport's air traffic control for an emergency landing. The crew requests to land on runway 27, which is Schiphol's longest runway built for emergency landings. The runway is made ready, but the Boeing 747 cargo aircraft is still high in the sky and close to the runway. This means that they would have to circle Amsterdam until they reduce the aircraft's altitude to that required for landing. As the crew goes on to circle Amsterdam for the second time, they extend the wing flaps and the inboard trailing edge flaps. These parts are still functional because they are being powered by the number 1 hydraulic system, which is still intact and functioning. The crew also extends the outboard trailing edge flaps, but it fails to respond because it is being powered by the number 4 hydraulic system, which has broken off the aircraft earlier. This means that the aircraft is being piloted with a partial flap condition. In other words, the aircraft would gain a higher pitch altitude than normal when slowed down. Because of how severe the damages are, the imbalanced engine configuration causes the left wing to generate more lift than the right wing, putting the aircraft at risk of rolling further to the right. This happened because the right outer wing control surface was damaged, and the pilots tried to stop the plane from sinking too fast by making the left engines work harder. As the aircraft slowed down, the ability to stop it from making a roll to the right was quickly becoming thin. After all the effort to keep the aircraft from rolling to the right, the Boeing 747 aircraft finally made an uncontrollable 90-degree roll to the right. Some residents saw the 747 coming and had just enough time to duck out of the way of the wall of fire that ripped through their homes, but most never knew what hit them. The plane struck the tower with immense force, splitting it in half. At exactly 18:35 Amsterdam's local time, the Boeing 747 cargo aircraft took a nosedive from the sky and crashed into 2 tower buildings, the Groningen Klein Kruitberg Flats in the bijlmerramp neighborhood of Amsterdam. The aircraft exploded at impact. The explosion was so intense that it caused part of the building to collapse inward and destroy numerous apartments. The aircraft was torn into several halves, with the cockpit located on the east side of the building. The tail of the aircraft broke off and was blown far back. In the heat of the incident, the Amsterdam Schiphol Airport Air Traffic Control made several attempts to contact the crew but couldn't. Not long after, the control tower announced the crash as the crash scene was visible from the control tower, and the aircraft had disappeared from the arrival control radar. The crash site was brimming with gigantic flames of fire, which consumed 10 floors of the buildings. No one escaped the impact of the aircraft crash. While most people died, witnesses reported seeing a few people jumping out of the building. Now, one of the most important questions that comes to mind is, what is the cause of this tragic incident? Well, when investigators arrived at the scene, the first thing they did was send divers to the bottom of Bijlmer Lake to search for the two engines that fell mid-air. At the time, there were several theories regarding what ripped two 5-ton engines off a 747. They first thought it was a missile or a bomb. To be certain, they needed to locate the two engines and examine them for clues. After hours of searching, the divers eventually located a large chunk of the aircraft's debris. They rushed the engines to a laboratory where they carefully examined the engines for traces of chemicals used in explosives. After 2 days of thorough examination, the scientists reported that they found no traces of explosives in the engine. Now that the explosive theory was out of the way, they had to consider other possibilities responsible for the crash. To solve this mystery, they needed to find the aircraft's inner engine, hoping that it holds the key, or locate the aircraft's flight recorder. After days of searching, they recovered the flight's black box at the crash site, but it had been destroyed. The tape was broken in 4 places, while the section that contained the data from the last 2.5 minutes of the flight was destroyed in the crash. However, even though the Boeing 747 cargo aircraft's flight data recorder was broken into 4 pieces, the recorder was still sent to the United States, where the data was extracted successfully. On the other hand, after canvassing the scene for days, the investigation team never found the cockpit voice recorder from the crash site, though El Al employees said that it was installed in the aircraft before the flight. This device would have provided insights into the conversations in the cockpit and the ones that occurred between the pilots and the air traffic tower during the flight. The total remains of the Boeing 747 cargo aircraft were taken to Schiphol for analysis at the end of the investigative sweep. The cause of the crash can be traced back to a problem that had been developing inside the 747's engine pylons since the day it rolled off the production line in 1979. The Boeing 747 engine pylon is attached to the wing by 4 fittings, 1 at the front, 1 in the back, and 2 in the middle, or mid-spar, as it is called. Each of these parts is linked together by a fuse pin. The 4 fuse pins are the weakest part of the pylon, but this is by design. Designing a fuse pin that is strong enough to hold an engine to the wing for years on end is no easy task. In 1979, Boeing realized that the fuse pins attached to the 747 were getting weaker earlier than expected, so they issued a bulletin to all operators that the fuse pins should be inspected every 2,500 hours. However, no inspection is perfect. 11 days after the crash, a diver discovered the 747's inner engine buried in mud. However, the team needed to handle it with care, as that was their only key to knowing what went wrong during the flight. After an examination, they discovered that nothing was wrong with the engine itself, but they noticed a dent in its outer casing. In the case of El Al Flight 1862, the fuse pins were strong enough to take on the load of the 747 at full thrust. However, in a situation where this suffers a crisis, like a mechanical seizure or a bird strike, the fuse pins can begin to vibrate. If this vibration continues for long and becomes more serious, the fuse pins can become loose and cause the engines to fall down. However, there were no signs that the inner engines were damaged, meaning the investigators were not close to the answer. Upon further examination of the inner engine, they observed that the fuse pins at the central fittings, which carried the bulk of the load, were missing. The top of the lug that held the fuse pins had also snapped off. To solve this mystery, over 20 workers were sent to where the crash debris was kept to search for the missing fuse pins. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack, but that was the only thing that could answer their questions. After 3 days of thorough search, one of the workers found the missing fuse pins. The fragments were taken to the lab, where they concluded that the fuse pins failed because they had been in operation for too long. These series and sequence of failures caused the inboard engine and pylon to break off from the aircraft. Its trajectory, when falling off, caused it to slam into the outboard engine and break it and its pylon off the aircraft wing. The leading edge of the right wing was also impacted badly. The damage to the right wing and the loss of hydraulic power prevented the correct operation of the Boeing 747 cargo aircraft flaps, which led to the crash of the aircraft. The El Al Flight 1862 crash killed all 3 of the crew members and 1 passenger aboard, including 39 people on the ground. However, the number of deaths could even be more due to the presence of undocumented immigrants in the buildings. The El Al Flight 1862 crash also left 26 people injured with 11 people hospitalized.